Hello everybody and welcome to OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack and today I'm here with Joe. A couple of weeks ago it was announced that Lysandre's trump card was going to be banned, and we just want to sort of share our thoughts on how it's going to affect the format, the reasons why the Japanese decided that this card needed to be banned, and then how it affects some of the decks in the format at the moment. Going back over the last video we did together where we looked at the decks you could play for nationals and then saying how it affects our choices. So, Joe, if you want to start with one of the reasons why it was decided that Lysandre's trump card should be banned.
Yeah, so Pokemon gave four reasons for why they banned trump cards. And the first one was that it eliminates one of your opponent's victory conditions. This is, of course, decking out. If you have no more cards to play, or to draw, I mean, that turn, you lose the game. So um, basically, if you just have one copy of trump card in your deck with four VS Seekers, you can pretty much constantly stream your deck. It's never a worry that you're going to deck out as long as you manage the fact that you have, or you know how many VS Seekers you have left in deck, pretty much. And as long as trump card's not prized, you're never going to deck out, and that gets rid of an entire strategy of the card game that's been around for a while. I know the most recent one probably that we all remember is Durant. I like playing that deck. It was trolly, it was annoying to play against, but it's a legitimate strategy trying to mill an opponent.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely, if your opponent um, starts to try and develop their own board too much, starts using their own junipers, it just doesn't help against stuff like Durant. So um, it's interesting that that maybe could be coming back into effect. I know there was somewhat a bit of panic because people are thinking back to the Durant days where no one really likes to lose to Durant, but at the moment in format, we have a Bunnelby that can mill two cards, which is literally half as good as Durant, and Durant didn't even win every game. It was always like fairly close, whether or not it would get a win through milling. So Bunnelby's not strong enough, I don't think, and it's too easy for other decks to set up anyway. They can set up in a turn now, so Bunnelby's just going to get raced too quickly, whereas Durant sometimes could stall long enough. The only other issue was the Ninjask that we have
Yeah.
that discards an execute from the hand and then discards the top card of your opponent's deck, I think it is. I guess we have Trick Shovel as well to do an extra four. But overall, we're not going to get that many uses out of those sorts of cards. Not enough to really scare off a lot of people, at least currently. But it's good to see that come back into the format in some capacity.
Yeah, definitely. Um, the second reason that they stated was the repeated use of powerful trainers, and these are things like Crushing Hammer, Hypnotoxic Laser, trainers that have an okay effect, often an effect on a coin flip, but when you have theoretically unlimited uses of them with Trump card, these effects become a lot stronger because you can then use your trainers, then trump card them back into your deck and reuse them, and do this on a repeated cycle over and over again. The main sort of culprit for this was Seismitoad decks because they ran so many of these what would normally be subpar trainers that then turned into super strong trainers with Lysandre's trump card, meaning that you could use the effects over and over again. Um, I know both from personal experience, we saw so much sort of Toad attacking like the energy and stuff rather than winning through damage. It just won through stalling, and it made the format quite stale for a while. So it's definitely an important reason to ban trump card. It also meant sort of the repeated use of ace specs as well. Ace specs that were designed to have you have one in your deck. For you to then trump card them back in it, theoretically you have another two, three of these again really strong trainer cards in your deck. It means that the sort of novelty of having one in the deck didn't really pay off as much as when the cards were initially released in Boundaries Crossed. I mean, they ultimately we were all presuming that they would have been rotated out in September, but considering Trump card has been around since November, that's 6 months where we've had again theoretically unlimited ace specs in our deck. It led to a very stale format as far as Toad was concerned because it meant that you were just running into the same Toad game after game, it knocking off your energies, it poisoning and sleeping you, and them doing it so much just because they didn't only have four chances to try and disrupt you. it was definitely an issue that I think the Japanese saw at one of their battle carnivals and realised maybe we need to address this issue because we don't want a stale game. We don't want a game which isn't enjoyable. And in Toad games, that was sometimes the case. So yeah, it was definitely an important reason just to sort of slow down some of these really powerful trainer decks and trainer based decks really from stalling you out of your game completely and just losing fun in the game overall.
Yeah, I actually think that's the most important point of the four in the list. Because if you think about Crushing Hammer before Trump Card, or if Trump Card's not a thing, you've got four in your deck. So you've got, on average, you're taking two energy out of the game from your opponent. That's two attachments. That's like, it's still a good thing. I mean, people still played Crushing Hammer before Trump Card. But it was really, you had to dedicate your deck to be an energy denial deck for that to actually pay off. Now, just having the four copies is, instead of just going, I'm going to get two discards to try and slow my opponent down. Now it's basically I'll flip until I get heads and just carry on. And if I keep missing them, even when it's not an important energy drop on the opponent's field, I'm still going to try and mill through the deck to find these crushing hammers because you never really know. I may as well just get those hammers, may as well just find them and use them. It's the same for Super Scoop Up. I think that's probably the most powerful trainer that we have. Just because it can be used to heal, can be used to draw now with Shaman, and it is a thing that it shouldn't be able to be used more than 4 times in a game. Just being able to use it like 16 times is just crazy because then you get so much usage out of that, so much value. There was just 4 cards in your deck.
There was a reason why Scoop Up Cyclone was one of in per deck. So when theoretically you can have like as many Scoop Up Cyclones or as many Scoop Ups in your deck, it just again makes for a very dull game on your opponent's side of the field because they're just constantly hitting heads, and if they're not, they're running through the deck to find the cards to eventually hit the heads anyway. It was definitely an issue, and I agree that it was the most important of the four. Yeah,
it wasn't just Toad that could abuse it. Obviously, Toad, as we've seen, it's probably the strongest deck with Trump Card in format. It probably does it the best, but there's other decks that could abuse it. Like you could abuse Life Dew in like Donphan decks. You could recycle Life Dew like 4 or 5 times just to stall people out. And in Japan as well, probably one of the biggest decks was Turn 1 Latios because Fast Ticket was in their format because they have a different rotation from us. They could do a Turn 1 like 170 or 180 attack if they kept respamming plus powers and then trump carded to reuse those plus powers to get up to 170 in a turn before your opponent could even draw for their turn. So I think that's kind of silly, and obviously that shouldn't be allowed in the game. So trump card, in a sense, just based on that fact alone, a lot of people were pretty much arguing that it should go just on that fact.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was probably one of the biggest reasons why what made Pokemon realize the creation that they'd made with trump card and all of these new first turn attacks.
Yeah, so that's probably the most important one. But let's move on to their third point that they made, and it's pretty much the same thing: drawing through your deck quickly with minimal repercussions. And this means, it allows you to mill through to find all these crazy good trainers. And it's like we said, you don't really have to manage resources like you used to in the game. It's pretty much an art form, this game. If you knew you had to, when you have to dig for things, and when you know, oh, this is like my third energy left in deck, I can't Juniper this turn, even if it would mean me getting a knockout. Now you can just pretty much YOLO. If I've got a VS Seeker or a Trump card in deck, I can just go hard through the deck until I find the things that I need, and then just recycle. But yeah, so that's like a hidden lost art in the card game, and I'm glad to see that come back.
Yeah, definitely. And then the final reason was it extends the time of battles and single matches, which is definitely something that I saw at Nationals. I know of 2 people that actually only got to... it was 50-minute best of 3 at our Nationals, and I know of a pair of people that actually didn't even finish game 1 just because of how long the turns were.
They took 5 prizes.
Yeah, 5 prizes were taken through the course of the game in 50 minutes, which you can sometimes understand it in sort of 30-minute games, but 50 minutes is far too long for a game, especially if you're not being distracted, if that's all you're doing. That was all caused by having stupidly long turns, sort of shamaning for so many, and then trump carding back in, and then using all of the draw supporters again, or draw trainers, again, to draw through your deck sort of twice in a turn. it just meant for stupidly long turns, and unfortunately, it led to some very long and sometimes very unwinnable games in the time sort of you were given. So yeah, it was definitely a big thing that it combined with Shaman's new draw power. It meant that turns were excessively long, and you couldn't even sort of call out your opponent for slow playing or anything because they genuinely had to make 20 or 30 decisions per turn, which would take, say, 10, 15 seconds each. That amounts up very quickly, and it meant you couldn't call on your opponent for slow playing or anything because they genuinely had to think about these decisions, which they would let you do because in any normal situation you would have to think about decisions like these, which led to, like I say, stupidly long turns, and it led to only 5 prizes being taken in one of the games at our UK Nationals, which I think still sort of baffles me today how long the turns are. I remember from personal experience that there was times where I was playing 20 or 30 cards per turn just because with access through trump card and shaman you have access to theoretically all of your deck up to twice. So it was a very very strong supporter card, and I think Pokemon made the right decision in deciding that it was going to be banned as of next week.
Yeah, I think overall everyone's pretty much unanimous in that it pretty much had to be done.
Yeah,
Uh, the format would not have changed until Cybertoad rotated, so everyone would have to play around Cybertoad for the next year, 2 years. So
yeah,
that's pretty grim concept to think about. So overall, although Toad is still going to be around in a pretty high capacity, I would imagine. Like it does get hurt quite a bit as its own attacker, but like as a deck revolving around just Toad, but it's obviously still a good card, and it's
yeah,
not like it's going
definitely.
to just vanish out of existence. But now it's actually a balanced card. It's not
Yeah,
like going into a game you're playing Size of Toad, you should win that game, whereas everyone else is trying to beat Toad
yeah.
or play Toad themselves.
Again, it was another thing that led to a very stale format, a very Toad-based format, which I I don't feel is the way the format should be. I feel the way it should be a varied format, um, and you shouldn't have to focus on beating one deck. You should focus on beating one deck but lose to another one. Whereas a lot of decks just lost to Toad because they couldn't deal with it.
Yeah. So let's actually move on to the impact in terms of our current format from the ban. So a lot of people, I know there's still a few nationals that are post the ban. So I'm sure you're all frantically testing, and hopefully this video can shed a bit of light on what we think, at least in theory, will change in terms of the format. And for those of you going to Worlds, even this might be a good little video to watch, and just in general for the future without trump card. I'm sure a lot of you have forgotten how to play the game without it. So the first deck we're going to talk about is Night March. And as soon as the ban came onto Poker Beach, I was looking through the comments, and I think I saw about 10 comments straight away just going, Night March OP, Night March best deck in format. All of these crazy comments. And I'm sorry to say, guys, it's not. There is still so many ways that you can beat Night March. So many decks can beat Night March, even though it's crazy fast and crazy hard hitting, I guess. Um, I mean, it's still capped at 220, I guess. You can play Revive now. You can play Muscle Man to actually knock out EXs and Megas, which is good. But there's still ways that people are going to beat you. Like, if you just play with full DC and then other energies, there's going to be turns where you miss attacks every now and again, especially if they're energy denying. You can use Aegislash to stop the use of DCE and basically stop your deck from working at all. Trevenant, if they wally you turn one, what are you going to do? Landorus can still beat it. Landorus bats, anything with bats really can beat it because a single Crobat drop kills a Joltik for 3 prizes pretty much. Donphan as well, really, really good at beating that deck. So there's plenty of things in the format that can handle Night March. So we need to sort of put a lid on this. That Night March is definitely not the best deck in the format. Just because Trump card is gone, it gets a bit better against some decks, but just other people are going to adapt to play against Night March. So we need to calm down on that front. On a similar note, Flareon as well with a Vengeance thing. Everyone thinks that's in a similar vein to Night March being really buffed with the lack of trump card. I don't actually think it is too much buffed because people played it with Archie and Polian and probably just 4 supporters or something like that. other than the Archie, I guess, or for Juniper, Archie, and then Trump card, I guess they played. Um, and that sort of strategy is not really useful to Flareon anymore because it will deck out too much too quickly. And I think my Flareon is going to have to go back to how it was in the old days when I used to like playing it, and it was just an anti-meta deck for cheap energy attackers. So Flareon good against the grass types, and then you have other things in there to deal with the other stuff in the format. So I'll be glad to see Flareon come back the way I remember it, but I don't think it can work how it used to.
No, no more big wombo combo Flareons.
Yeah,
So the next sort of biggest deck, I guess, is Toad. We've touched on it briefly, and there's not much else to say. Toad, as its own deck, gets a lot weaker, just because it doesn't have access to all of like we say these strong trainers that it can just abuse over and over and over again. Um, it's meant that it means that Toad does itself get worse, and like, well, not worse, but it gets more balanced, which feels odd to say, but it does. It just gets more balanced, and then with the little damage output that it has, it becomes overall a weak deck on its own. It could definitely still see some play, and I definitely still think you could do well with it, but I don't think it's anywhere near as reliable as it once was, especially post ban. I think what we're going to see, and we're going to touch on Yveltal decks a little bit later on, but we're going to see more of Toad featuring in Yveltal decks and Aroma Box decks to slow things down rather than to completely lock your opponent out of the game. It's going to slow them down while you set up a huge attacker on the bench and then swing for 4 prizes in 2 turns. Definitely the sort of quad Toad, quad Shaman, and then lots of abusive trainers will see a lot less play just because they have one chance at using these trainers, and if they don't get to use these trainers, if they don't get the heads on these trainers, then they have a severely worse matchup against you because Toad itself does not hit hard. It hits especially hard when they don't have energy and you have laser flips, and without those you're capped at 50, sometimes 80 damage a turn, whereas they can build up, say, a Yveltal or a Mega Rayquaza, anything like that can just sweep a Toad in a turn. It definitely makes the deck a lot weaker because they can't abuse the trainers as they once were able to. I
yeah.
think,
The big thing for Toad was that with Trump card, you can keep recycling the lasers to keep your output pretty much, above average, and also just respamming hammers meant that they could never fully develop their board. Even if people play 4 hammers now, there'll be a point when someone can finally catch up to the Toad player and then start out hitting them pretty much. So it probably needs to either add cards like the bats to keep it to maintain that output, or even increase it in the early game to try and race your opponent a bit more, so that you don't hit that late game and then you're just stuck hitting for 50 a turn and just like sort of looking at your opponent as he builds his board up. Or you could play, yeah, like you say, Yveltal. Toad Yveltal was around before Trump card. It was still a tier 1 deck. So that's still an option for it. It could still have Manectric. That's an option. Toad Manectric Garb was a nice little deck running around. It does quite well. So there's still definitely options for Toad. It just, he needs partners now to keep his output like through the late game. The mid to late game is where it struggles, when it can no longer spam the lasers or the hammers. So yeah, that's how it's going to have to adapt.
yeah, definitely.
So let's move on to another deck. I think this gets a lot better as well. It's Donphan. Donphan, I was actually close to playing it for Nationals, and the only reason I didn't was because it only had a 50-50 at best against Seismitoad. And I think with Seismitoad getting worse, I think Donphan's a great player right now. Also, it's fantastic against Night March, like I said. Can absolutely destroy Night March. The way we have seen Donphan, though, it will have to adapt a little bit. I like to play a build where you just kept recycling the Robo Subs and had Life Dew being recycled. Now it's going to have to be more traditional and have a few walls in there. Stuff like Sigilyph, stuff like Wobbuffet maybe to slow people down. You could even play Aegislash. Aegislash I think is a great play right now with the amount of specials around. You'd still probably play Horluchas if you do have to deal with Seismitoad. And because you're not getting hammered away as much, you're going to get maybe 1 or 2 wrecks off in a game to help you beat that Seismitoad player. So I think Donphan gets a lot stronger overall in the format. So I think that's probably a good play if you're thinking about going to a nationals or a worlds event.
Yeah, definitely. The next deck is Rayquaza Raichu, and for me personally, I feel this is the most. This is the deck that could. Um, I feel we. No one really knows how it's going to fully affect the deck yet. But it makes Rayquaza and Raichu a lot slower. Um, they a lot of players just ran sort of 4 Juniper, 1 Trump card, and purely trainer draw support that would run through the deck at breakneck pace and then trump it all back in and then just be happy with drawing 1 card a turn all the way through their deck just because they've built up such a board you can't even deal with it. Now that they can't do that, the Rayquaza Raichu player will easily deck themselves out if they do that anymore. Because despite how fast people think Rayquaza is, it can still take time to take 6 prizes, and sometimes that's just too long before you deck yourself out. So it's going to be a lot more reliant on energy. It means that you can't sort of throw your energy away and then rely on getting the Mega Turbos because you're running through the deck super quickly. It may mean you have to attach an energy turn one and miss the turn one. Whereas with the Trump card build, you could happily discard the energy and know that you're going to get these Mega Turbos. You now may have to sort of slow your whole strategy down. You may not even see very many turn one Rayquazas anymore, just because the deck itself is a lot slower. And then the other thing that it will probably see is a way of locking Skyfield into play, i.e. Ninetales, or more of an eggs build where they can consistently get the Skyfield and then just throw 3 Pokemon on the bench when they need to through eggs, just to sort of breach that amount of damage and one-shot anything in the format, and then just be happy doing 150 holding the Skyfields because they know there's only 4 Skyfields now. There's not unlimited Skyfields. They've only got 4 Skyfields to play with, and therefore they can't be throwing them down just for them to be discarded straight away. You have to make sure you're using the Skyfields as and when you need them to knock out EXs rather than just to be spectacular on a 1 prize non-EX. You have to hold the Skyfields. It becomes a lot more. I feel Rayquaza becomes a lot more strategic rather than just bursting huge damage. You now have to think, do I play this now or do I hold it and wait and then play the Skyfield later on? I feel there's definitely still a place for Rayquaza Raichu in the top tables, but I think because it gets slower, it becomes it becomes worse because the big impact of Rayquaza was being able to being able to prepare this 220 HP monster that does 240 damage on theoretically turn 1. That itself is a scary concept. Now taking that back and thinking, well, they can't get it set up turn 1 a lot of the time, and sometimes they can't even get set up to do enough damage on turn 2 because they can't draw enough. Okay, Rayquaza Raichu is a lot easier to deal with. Toad, I still personally feel Toad sometimes struggle with it, so there may be less good matchups for Rayquaza across the board as well. But I don't think Rayquaza Raichu is too hurt. It definitely gets slower, and it definitely means that you can't have sort of turbo Ray builds anymore. But I think there's still definitely a place for it in the top tables.
Yeah, I think it's crucial what you said about the execute. I think you have to switch to a more battle compressor heavy Rayquaza deck. So instead of going milling through the deck overall, you're just being selective about going, okay, I'll battle compressor away, an energy for my Mega Turbo, and 2 eggs for my bench. This way, you're not going through 30 cards to then look for Pokemon, energy. You're just going, I'll get rid of these so I can use them at a later point. It is probably going to be slower. It is helped out a lot that Toad can't just hammer spam, so eventually it will overpower a Toad player, or at least get KOs on it. Because sometimes if you're playing Rayquaza, you literally never attack against a Toad player unless you're just doing the regular EX's attack. So at least you can pressurize Toad players now that they can't Crushing Hammer every turn. So it does gain some help against Toad matchups. But yeah, it has to be a lot more selective about how it goes about things. And if it draws bad hands where you have to Juniper away like 2 Skyfields, you might just have to actually not do that and just sort of pass and hope for your opponent to end you or something at some point, or you
Yeah,
draw into a
definitely.
different supporter. So it's going to have to be more traditional in how it's set up. You can't just play the 4 Juniper like you say.
Yeah, I think that will determine how well Ray does, because no one really tried it as a more traditional Ray. Everyone thought, okay, let's go turbo with this. Let's hit 240 damage on turn 1, turn 2. I think now switching to a more traditional supporter line, that will define how well Raichu Rayquaza does, because if it can't cope with the normal supporter line, then maybe it isn't as good as everyone first predicted before the trump card ban.
Yeah. So the next one we're going to talk about is Groudon, and as a deck itself, Groudon doesn't change too much at all. Really, it really was not too affected by Trump card at all. It rarely will deck itself out. It doesn't have that draw power. You normally use Wobbuffet, so you're not drawing crazily with Shamans. You use stuff like Karina to be selective through your deck, take the things you want rather than mill like crazy via Junipering every turn. So Groudon doesn't get affected that much. It's just that Groudon itself is a card that is really good in certain metagames and really bad in other metagames. Like now it has bad matchups in the form of Donphan. Donphan can absolutely stomp Groudon easily. Night March probably beats Groudon as well, just because it can use non-EXs to keep swinging hard damage. Flareon can probably beat it. And also, Groudon's best matchup was Seismitoad, and if Seismitoad's getting worse, it just loses its favorite matchup, which is kind of bad for Groudon. So, although you don't have to change much of your 60 card deck, if you're the Groudon player, your matchups become much worse, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. Another deck that's relatively unchanged is Manectric variants. They were never overly reliant on trump card at all. And like we said earlier on, I feel the only big thing related to Manectric is you may see more, like Joe said, Manectric Toad Garb decks, um, because this is the way you're going to have to play Toad now. You're going to have to play it as a stall option rather than a lockdown option. Um, and by stalling your opponent down, stalling your opponent, you can get a a Manectric or a Mega Manectric even down, and just sort of swing for really efficient, huge damage. 110 is still a huge number, um, and it just means that you'll have to slow your opponent rather than completely stall your opponent. But bar that, Manectric really doesn't change too much. There's not much Manectric relied on when it came to trump card. It often played one, but that was more because everything played one, not because it needed one. There was nothing overly reliant that the Manectric player needed to use over and over again.
Yeah, it was more of like a just in case card. Like if you have an ugly hand where you have to get rid of 2 Spirit Links or something, you can just think, okay, I can trump card them back. Now you can just play an extra Spirit Link or something like that, or an extra Manectric, thicker lines of stuff. I think we might see that in general across a lot of decks.
Yeah,
Have thicker lines of megas. People are being cheeky with 3/3s because if one's prized, who cares? I can trump card back. So in general, that might be something we see in trump card. And for Manectric, when I played it with the Mega, the only reason I played trump card was the backup clause if I have dodgy hands, really.
yeah,
So we'll move on to one that is a bit more affected, Trevenant. I still think Trevenant can definitely survive without the ban of trump card because volleying turn one Trevor is still really good. It's much better than Toad, I think, actually now, because Toad, we've mentioned how it can't continue with the output. Well, Trevenant's base output is actually much nicer than Toad, and it does the lock just as quickly, pretty much. The only issue is it has the less draw power through Shamans. You probably play less Shamans and then have other things in the deck. You could play stuff like Raichu to be sort of anti-type and take easy knockouts here and there on a Shaman or a Rayquaza. You can also throw in Gengar for constant attacking, hitting and switch strategy. Um, Overall, you just have to take out some of the trollier things like the hammers that you used to play. Trevenants were actually less heavy on the fact that they played so many hammers and stuff like that. A lot of the time, they respammed lasers just for really big output for two-shotting even megas most of the time. Um, so it does get slightly hurt, but I actually think it's probably the best trainer lock we have post trump card.
yeah. I think it definitely loses a lot. It doesn't gain, but it loses a lot less than Toad does.
Yeah.
And then finally, before we go into some up and coming decks, I'm just going to go over sort of fighting in general. And again, it just sort of, much like the opposite of the Groudon, well, what we said about the Groudon, it just gets a few better matchups overall. Landorus Bats really struggled against Toad, but now Toad's less important. Landorus Bats could potentially see some more play, because the output on the deck is insanely high. You put so many counters on the board so quickly, and sometimes that's just enough to be able to sort of tip the opponent or tip your win over the edge, and you win. And then the sort of Horlucha Bats that Martin Cornwall played, that we featured on the Michael Cornwall, sorry, that we featured on the channel the other day. That's again another good deck, that definitely improves with Trump Card. Obviously, Horlucha's traded so well against Toads, but it wasn't completely reliant on a Toad heavy format to do well, because it trades well with any EX. It was just so good at getting through Toad Lock, but I feel like Horlucha Bats is still a really good play at the moment, and I think a lot of fighting variants improve overall, just because they were never hugely reliant on Trump Card, so the ban doesn't affect them too much, and they lose one of their main opponents in Toad because they're not weak to well, Landorus was weak to Toad, but now, because Toad's not being seen as much, it means that Landorus can sort of come out of its shell once again, and like I said, plays counters everywhere on the board.
Yeah, it benefits as well. Like Rayquaza was kind of a dodgy matchup. If that's getting slower and having to use eggs, that can just really play into the favor of a Landorus player. Night March is obviously going to hate getting sniped around, be it the bats or the Landorus itself. So I think that gains a lot of support, really, or a lot of better matchups. So let's go on to some of the ones that we put near the bottom of the pile, pre-UK Nationals. But for those of you going to Nationals and Worlds events, obviously post the Trump Card ban, these are ones to put back on your radar, I would imagine. And the first one we're going to talk about is Virgen. I think Virgen gets much nicer. It has a lot more good matchups. Seismitoad, the issue it had against it was that it would never actually get an attack off. Now you just have to wait for them to run out of Crushing Hammers to actually finally get an Emerald Slash and try and overpower a Toad player. If they're playing like a Toad Yveltal, it's a fairly even matchup, pretty much. If you play like a few DCEs and Raichu as well, I'm pretty sure that's going to be the most popular way to play Virgen these days, because Raichu can help out in matchups that are less good, i.e. Yveltal and Rayquaza. So other than that, it can deal with quite a lot of things. It has some sniping to deal with Night March, maybe. You can also always use that red signal. Never underestimate that. It can really do well picking off Shamans for everyone. If you just have one Deoxys in play, it has a great Donphan matchup, I think, or at least a slightly above average. I don't think it's great, actually. I think it's about 60% when I played Virgin, at least. Yeah, phenomenal Groudon matchup. It can handle Manectric. So, yeah, I think Virgin is one to put back on the radar overall.
Yeah. Again, I sort of touched on it earlier, but Yveltal is definitely one that we could see on the top tables again. Simply because if Donphan gets bigger, Yveltal gets bigger, because Yveltal is so good against Donphan, with resistance and baby Yveltals having resistance, and having Toad to stall. You definitely can stall. You can outstall the Donphan player now, because they can't play their Robo Subs. They can't play sort of some of their Trollier cards, and they're doing 20 less damage for every hit they make. It means that the big sort of Donphan giving huge damage out and then hiding on the bench isn't giving huge damage out anymore, and it sort of means, because they've only got 4 Robo Subs now, they can quite easily hit through the Robo Subs with Oblivion Wing on a baby Yveltal, power up a big Yveltal, and then just Lysandre up a Donphan and kill it in one shot. And they can do this once or twice a game, and if you can't sort of get out more than one or two Dom fans, then all of a sudden you're on a on a very uphill battle, because of the resistance and things like that. Yveltal never particularly had hugely bad matchups. Obviously, things like Manectric are bad, and anything with Raichu's bad. But the biggest thing that slowed Yveltal down was the fact that it couldn't deal with the decks that one shot. Yveltal was always our big hitter, and then when all of a sudden we've got two really strong decks that can one shot in a turn, it sort of made Yveltal seem slightly weak. But now these decks aren't as good anymore, and there's no completely locking you out of the game. Yveltal definitely stands a chance of coming back up into the ranks, just because it's another of these really efficient attackers. For 2 energy, it can do huge damage, especially if you're against something that's built itself up to try and deal with the Yveltal. Yeah, it's definitely one that you could see on the top tables again that isn't as affected by trump cards as a card, but is affected more so by the matchups that are now around and the fact that it can deal with Domfan incredibly well.
Yeah, it's also good to note that the non-EX Yveltal can trade on like Trevenant really well, and it can also do fairly okay against Night March if you're just Lysandering up Joltix for fun. So you have plays against quite a lot of the big decks. So Yveltal's going to be good. We know it's a strong card. It's got a lot going for it. It just needed a bit of support, and it actually turned out that losing a card helped it
Yeah.
a lot, really. So the last one we really want to talk about is Kyogre. I think this is another like sleeper in the format. I think it's got good matchups now. It's got a great Donphan matchup. This is mainly because of Rough Seas. Rough Seas makes this deck very good. So it takes Donphan an absolute stone age to kill a Kyogre. It really forces plays out of Night March players, like how many revives they actually play if they can start knocking you out. Obviously, it has a good Flareon matchup unless they're playing tons of Leafeon. Leafeon's the only real issue for the deck. Seismitoad, again, if it's not hammering you turn after turn, you're going to overpower them eventually, and they just do pitiful damage against you when you're considering Rough Seas. They're like never going to knock out a Primal once you get it up and running. Rayquaza Raichu, that's probably an issue. Them being slower can be the best thing for you. Also, you can just play 2 Suicune and ask the question of how many non-EX attackers they're playing. And if it's not that many, then you might just win that way. I know one of my friends went to Nats playing Kyogre with a few Suicune in there, and he won games. He just forced scoops from people because he had Suicune and they had nothing for it as Rayquaza players. It can stand up to Groudon. It can stand up to Manectric, definitely. Manectric has to 3-shot it when you consider Rough Seas. It really struggles against Virgin. That's a big issue. But for the most part, it's good against even Yveltal because you can do like Lysandre plays to take 4 prizes in a turn, which is really nice. So against the majority of things, Kyogre has great matchups now. It just does have that hiccup of Virgin and still anything playing Leafeon. If it's like a stage 1's deck or just a Flareon, like a dedicated Flareon build, that's going to be a real issue for it. But hopefully just the reduced speed of Rayquaza makes that a winnable matchup now. And overall, I think it can tank a lot of things. It's probably the best tank deck we have now. Probably outclasses Groudon in terms of tanking because the heal is so big. Keeping itself out of range for the most part is just really nice.
Yeah. So yeah, they're the main decks that are affected by it. Obviously, we spoke a lot more about more about a lot of other decks on our past nationals video, but we feel these are sort of the decks that are you're likely to see that have been affected the most by this ban. It's pretty interesting that it's been the first ban in sort of I think about 12 years. So yeah, that's relatively interesting. But there's nothing that hasn't been said already that we want to talk about as far as how that sort of happening. The biggest thing I think we all want to avoid is a ban list rather than a rotation, but I highly doubt we will get anything like that. I think this was just a one-off condition that Pokemon realised that they needed to sort of fix the monster that they'd made in Lysandre's trump card, and this was really highlighted by that turn 1 Latios deck over in the Japanese Battle Carnival at the end of May. I think that was the biggest reason that they decided that we need to look at how we need to deal with this situation. And I think they've done it really effectively. I think this is good for the game. It keeps it fresh. It keeps it interesting. And yeah, I think overall it's a good ban. I think it's the right thing to do. But bar that, there's not much else for us to say. I think it's been about a half an hour video of just us talking about one card. But that's how influential this card was. So thank you very much for watching. Keep your eyes out on the channel. We are planning on having a 500 subscriber giveaway, because we hit 500 subscribers about a week and a half ago, I think it was now. So yeah, that's crazy. So we've decided that we're going to have another giveaway. We haven't finalised anything yet, but make sure you keep your eye on the channel. Just making sure to get in on the giveaway if you can. And bar that, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack from OmniPoke, and we will see you all in another video.